Hello, my name is Austin Imhoff, and this is my podcast. Today I'll be talking about traditional gender roles in Africa, what that means in modern society, where they come from, and what it possibly looks like in the future and change. So, this is for my final presentation for African Studies for Dr. Cologne. So, let's get started. First, I'd like to preface I apologize, Professor, if I stutter through my words, and to my viewers. This is my first podcast. Um, but the reason why I chose this is because I really do believe that you can get your information out much easier just discussing. I had hoped to have had someone on my podcast to discuss, but unfortunately I could not get someone. So I'm just here on my porch, sitting, talking into my microphone. So let's get into it. Some of the information that I've gathered about traditional gender roles in Africa. So, some background. I have somewhat of a script. Um, Historically, many African societies, they've had very clear ideas about men and women were supposed to do. For example, among the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania, men, they were warriors and herders, so they were responsible for cattle protection, keeping families safe, while women, they would take care of children. So this also meant like doing domestic chores, farming, just being the motherly figure of the house. So these roles, they weren't just practical, they were central to a good social order. And in terms of sources, I'd like to point out, this source is from African Women: A Modern History, which was written by Kathleen Sheldons. Um, so throughout my podcast, I will list references in which I find to be influential. If I don't, however, I'm going to submit a document with all my references that I used throughout this podcast. So, yeah. So, the roots of gender roles in Africa, um, like I mentioned before, with each and every topic, I'm going to introduce facts, but I'm also going to give my own personal opinion and what I see from the facts that I've gotten. So, I mean, African history is absurdly old. So, traditional gender roles have been around for a long, long time. And like it mentioned before, especially in the source that I referenced, is that it's not just practical. It's been they're really these are the traditional gender roles and the roles that have been in place for a long, long time. So it's not just for, oh, we're just going to do it this way. This is also the way it's been done, and people within these different tribes and countries have found that it works. And I'd also like to talk about, it is, I guess, I wouldn't say difficult, but I have to watch myself sometimes because, as someone who has Western ideals and as um, a male who's a feminist, I mean, I have two sisters and a mother, I view traditional gender roles not in the same light as, say, people in other countries do, and so I try to look at this with as much understanding, and also not assuming in any way, not assuming that our way is any better, or that Western ideals are better. So I think that's an important thing to talk about when discussing traditional gender roles, especially in Africa. All right. Also, the nice thing about a podcast is I can take a sip of water. So now, Africa is obviously a very large place. Um, it's not just one thing. There's a lot of different groups that have different norms. So, example, among the Yoruba, I think Yoruba. Sorry if I mispronounce anything. The Yoruba of Nigeria, women historically played very key roles in trade and religious rituals. And some pastoralist societies like the Fulani, women are quite independent and participate actively in decision making. Um, this comes from Gender and Development in Africa from Amina Mamas. So, about this, there's diversity to what traditional gender roles can mean. Like I mentioned before, in the Maasai, and also like in Tanzania, um, that could mean you're doing more domestic chores like farming, but that could also mean that you're playing more key roles in, like I mentioned, trade and religious rituals. So diversity across Africa is extremely important when talking about traditional gender roles. It's not just going to be, one thing. It's not going to be like we're assuming domestic. You know what I mean? So I think that's important to talk about. So I think the most important thing to talk about is like why these communities want to maintain traditional gender roles. And I guess that's the biggest question for me as well. You know, again, like I mentioned, I have a mom and two sisters, and to me, it's like, how could you, wouldn't you want to break barriers and break traditional gender roles? But that's again my Western, my Western ideal showing through. Um, so there are communities and individuals in Africa who actually want to preserve, traditional gender roles. For many, these roles are seen as part of their culture identity and also social stability. Like I mentioned before, it's not just something that's, randomly popped up. It's been in their social aspect of life for many years. So an example, some groups believe that traditional gender roles help to maintain family cohesion and community harmony. They argue that these roles are rooted in thousands of years of cultural history. So, a study by Amina Mama, The Politics of Gender and Culture in Africa, um, discusses how many people see Western ideals about gender equality as kind of a threat to their cultural traditions. Which, again, I'm going to stop right there. I understand completely about tradition, but again, I guess one section at the end of this podcast will discuss, how do you weigh the how do you weigh so sorry for my pause. How do you weigh about like saying, "Oh, well, my ideals must be better than these ideals." You can't, but then I understand it also gets to a certain point, like, do we have the moral not the moral right, but I guess I know I would say somewhat the moral right, or does everyone have the moral right to choose what gender roles they decide to involve themselves in? So like I said, a lot of these different countries in Africa and the people who practice traditional gender roles in these countries see gender equality as a threat to cultural traditions. So, in some cases, traditional gender roles are linked to religious beliefs or social practices that are deeply embedded in community life. So, another example, in certain communities, men are viewed as the protectors and providers, and women as caregivers, roles that they see as natural and um, more, I would say natural, but also more in a religious sense. Like I mentioned, a lot of these traditional gender roles come from a religious background. So, additionally, some women themselves also prefer these traditional gender roles because they provide a clear sense of identity and purpose, and they might see modern gender equality as disruptive or confusing, which I understand. I do get that, but I think the thing that we need to talk about um, and is if these women were given the actual chance to participate in gender equality and more modern gender roles, would their opinions be changed? Or would they still truly believe that, their their social life would be much better off if they had just stayed within their traditional gender roles? I understand. Um, so this view can be super strong in more rural areas where access to education or economic opportunities are more limited. And traditional gender norms are seen as a form of social security. So I just think I understand where a lot of people come from, especially these different countries in Africa, on maintaining traditional gender roles. I think the biggest question to ask is if these people, especially when we mostly talk about traditional gender roles in Africa, we're talking about women because they're the ones who are much less limited to what they want to do. So the question is here is if they were given the opportunity to change, then would they? You know? So that's just something I think to think about. Um and then another, like I mentioned before, comparing and contrasting Western and African ideals about gender. So, on one side, many Western countries, especially over the last century, there's been much more of a push for gender equality. So, challenging stereotypes, promoting individual rights, feminism, emphasizing that gender roles are not just a social construct, but they can be changed, you know? Um, So, like I mentioned before, Amina Mama's work explains how Western feminism is often it often promotes the idea that everyone should have the freedom to choose. I think choose is a very important word. Their gender roles, which can clash with communities that see those roles as part of their cultural heritage. Um, but also, I think these ideas aren't mutually exclusive. You know, some African communities are really embracing change, while others they want to hold on to their tradition. Um, but I think education, media, a lot of like young activism, people are really pushing for more equality, especially in Africa. Um, I think also the largest thing is age. You know, when you think about large amounts of social change, you think about the difference in age. So another question is these traditional gender roles in Africa, will they change with the growing population of young people, you know? And then the future. So what's next? Um, I think in the future, um, this comes from the inter uh, parliamentary union. My apologies. So the quote is, so what's next? It's likely that we'll see a mix, some communities embracing more gender equality, especially in urban areas, while others prefer to stick to traditional gender roles. Countries like Rwanda have made impressive progress. Over 60% of their parliament seats are held by women, thanks to policies promoting gender balance. So, just a little fact there. Will this change? Will it continue to be so? I personally believe it will change. I mean, change is inevitable, especially in the 21st century. I'm not saying I'm not personally putting my opinion in because, again, I don't feel as though it's my place to talk about traditional gender roles in Africa as a white man with privilege in the U.S. You know, especially when we say traditional gender roles in Africa, like I mentioned before, we're talking about women and their gender roles in Africa mostly. So I think understanding both sides, um, this is really really important. Understanding both sides about like these gender roles isn't just about, it's not about biology and specific gender, but it's also about culture, the history behind these different African countries and also community. So, some people see traditional gender roles as vital to their identity, while others see change as a path to greater freedom. So, that is my podcast, and I would personally like to thank you, Professor, because presenting this information in this way, it was much better than doing, I believe, a paper or a presentation, because it gave me the freedom to talk, about my opinions. And I actually during this podcast had thoughts that happened on the fly, going off of my script and just having little discussions with myself, even though that sounds insane. But but yeah, thanks for listening to my podcast today. I hope this gives you a new perspective, something to think about. So, yeah. Thank you so much. Bye bye.